Thank you for joining us on From the Lectern. This is Dr. Walter Strickland here at the campus of Southeastern Seminary in the college at Southeastern. I'm joined with a special guest, Ray Chang. It's good to have you here with us, brother.
It's great to be here.
He is the Ministry Associate for Discipleship in the Chaplain's Office at Wheaton College.
That's right.
And so today we're going to have a conversation that I think is very important, really trying to figure out how to move beyond the black and white binary. Oftentimes From the Lectern, our conversations are to discuss important topics and issues, not just to point out where things have gone wrong, but to identify those things and see how we can make them right as ministers of the gospel. So today, my hope is to discuss this this dynamic in America's history. Oftentimes, because of the prominence of slavery in the historical narrative, subsequently Jim Crow, and then all of the legal difficulties that African Americans have had, just dealing with oppression in America, it's easy, especially in the South. We're in Wake Forest, North Carolina, to talk about racial reconciliation and diversity and have it strictly be a black-white thing. And so today we want to talk about how to move beyond that, because if we're talking about every tribe and every tongue and every nation, that's far more than just black and white.
That's right. That's right.
And so the story of Asian Americans in America is far less discussed and told, but how have Asian Americans have struggled in America at times?
Yeah. Well, I do think that the black and white binary is helpful to some degree. It takes a very complex reality, the racial realities of America, and tries to condense it and simplify it in understandable and digestible terms. I think it also is helpful because it highlights the disparities, the marginalization, the oppression that African Americans have experienced throughout the course of America's history. And I think it rightly gives attention to that oppression and to those experiences. I do think that the black and white binary can be hurtful as well, as you alluded to. That it kind of eliminates the experiences of everyone else unintentionally. I do think that it tends to be a little overly simplistic and reductionistic, and as I said, it tends to erase all the other experiences, especially the experiences of oppression that even First Nations folk or Asian Americans or Latinos and Latinas have experienced throughout the course of history. And simultaneously, it erases the experiences of poor whites. All right?
That's very true.
And so it makes one type of white experience a normative experience and an archetype for all other experiences to be kind of seen through, and that sometimes tends to leave poor whites in the dust as well. I think some negative things that it also does is that it puts us in competition with each other. So you'll hear you'll hear when Asian Americans talk about their oppression, other minority groups or other groups of color or subdominant groups will say, well, we have had it worse. And that, though that may be true, it ends up silencing the discussion and the collaboration that could take place. And I think that really hinders the pursuit of racial justice and racial reconciliation, which will lead to racial unity. And without us knowing, it ends up maintaining the racial realities that we're all seeking to fight and to push away. And so when you ask about like Asian Americans or the Asian American experience, a lot of people don't recognize the history, and I think history is going to be a critical piece in understanding the current and contemporary experiences, because our history oftentimes drags into the present, into the future. So, for example, a lot of people might not know, some people will know, that Asian Americans were brought in or Asians were brought in a lot of times as replacement labor for slaves when slavery was overturned, and very different. Obviously, the experience. No one really experienced more atrocity than African Americans did, maybe apart from the Native Americans who were genocided, but they were never viewed as American, whereas Africans were viewed as American from the beginning, as they were part of the construction of what we now know as America or the United States. Then Asians were also brought in to work on plantations, especially in Hawaii, and then work on the railroads to achieve manifest destiny. Chinese were brought in, and they were pit against the Irish. Chinese were going from the west to the east. The Irish were placed in the east, going to the west, and in Promontory Point in Utah is where the two ends met. But Chinese were often placed to do things that no one else would be willing to do. Like so, many would freeze to death as they were entering the Rockies, or being slung down. There's a phrase called Chinaman's chance that we heard, and where that came from was when Chinese people were put into very risky situations, basically slung over the side of a cliff in order to place explosive, in order for the railroad to be placed. And then you have major events like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then the Japanese mass incarceration during World War II, where Japanese Americans were placed in incarceration camps. And then you have some people might know this, but the largest single lynching in America was actually to Chinese people in Los Angeles in the 1700s. So Asians did not get lynched to the magnitude of African Americans in terms of sheer quantity, but we have overlaying experiences that I think are oftentimes ignored because of the black and white binary.
I mean, I guarantee that this is the first time that some of our listeners are hearing some of the atrocities dealt Asian Americans. And you're right. The things that happen in history are often the wounds that the gospel needs to heal. And so as ministers of the gospel, it helps us to understand what those things are and their long-term influence because of the reality of collective memory, that collective consciousness that a people hold that goes back to their past that they're bringing with them, because oftentimes you're in homes where people are discussing and thinking through what's happened, and then now how do we go forward. And so ministers of the gospel of every background has to understand these things because we need to know exactly what we're ministering to, what we're trying to heal from.
That's good.
So before we jump into some of the nitty gritty of how to minister in that environment, there's so much here, in your. I mean, that was a wonderful historical introduction to this issue. How do we understand the depth of the brokenness and the narrative of one people or peoples, as we'll talk about in a moment, and not lose the every tribe, tongue, and nation sort of idea that the scripture is getting at? Because it's one thing for us to just think, just lump all the. It's easier to think about it in the form of binaries. But when we're looking at, okay, now you're saying that I have to minister to African Americans and Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans, and how do we do the work of bringing them together, but not losing those distinctions and those helpful and great heritages?
Yeah, I think that we have an efficiency model of ministry that prevents us from wanting to do more incarnational ministry. And you look at the life of Jesus, and he was anything but efficient. You look at the redemptive arc of the scriptures, and it's completely inefficient. I mean, it took thousands of years for God to bring about the Messiah, in Jesus Christ. And you could have thought maybe he could snap a finger and solve the problems right away. But there was something about the way that God works that shows how ministry is not intended to necessarily be efficient, which doesn't mean that we don't adopt, great strategies or wise ways of doing things, but that we ultimately take our model and our example from Jesus, and we see that he was very incarnational, that he took the time to get to know. So you look at the woman at the well, and what was most remarkable about her is that Jesus went to her at a time when she was very ashamed, but he first saw her, Then he supernaturally knew her, right? Because he knew that she was, she had been married 5 times with 5 husbands, and the person that she was living with now wasn't her husband. But then he knew her, and then because he knew her, she was able to see that he loved her because he was approaching her. And I think in a similar way, because we live in a racialized society and our church has been overlaid on top of a racialized society, our church is not freed from the racialized realities that we live in. It might take a more inefficient model of ministry as we approach all the different groups, so that we're not seeing everyone as monolithic or trying to shove everyone into a specific box or category, or saying, if you don't fit with us, which sometimes you tend to see church staffs hiring, and they'll say, we want to find someone that's a good fit. It oftentimes means a cultural fit more than a theological fit, and the cultural fit usually keeps perpetuating some of the same norms that oftentimes make other people feel excluded. And so I think that in order to do reconciliation ministry well, or to not lose the unity of the gospel that exists, while simultaneously acknowledging and loving all the different groups that are amongst us, or even within our neighborhoods, because a lot of times, we say, we want to attract those within our neighborhood, but then, it's only a certain part of our neighborhood that we attract. I think the first thing we have to do is see the people in our midst. Then we have to get to know them, and then we, in that knowledge of them, choose and continue to love them. And I think that's the way that we can make progress in this sense.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you hit it on the head when you said we have to choose to take an inefficient model of ministry, which is really countercultural, because everything around us is about efficiency. It's about ease, the way that we eat, the way that we digest information. We don't read at length anymore. We want Twitter, we want headlines, we'll skim an article just to sound like we're an expert, but we really have no clue about what we're talking about. I mean, which I love that admonition to have an inefficient, at least in America right now, a seemingly inefficient ministry for that purpose. And just to quickly sort of take that and run with it one step further, you mentioned hiring. It takes longer to find people who are well qualified, who are of a different background. Not because they're not there, it's because your relational network usually doesn't extend into those networks where those people are. So you have to begin to till new ground in order to be able to find those folks. And that seems inefficient.
Very inefficient.
Because after all, there's all this other stuff to do, and we're wasting time trying to find these people. So I really appreciate that. I think that's very, very helpful for people to take and run with. So I often get nervous when someone brings words that I've written up to me, so I'm going to do it to you because I'm the one asking the question. And so in the context of talking about bearing each other's burdens, which is ultimately sort of what we're getting at in this conversation, you've written that, quote, "The unfortunate reality is that the burdens have been so disproportionately and heavily laid on brothers and sisters of Black, Native American, Asian, and Latino backgrounds." And so as we sort of transition into talking about, okay, here's a historical discussion about how there's hurt in the Asian American community, and then here is, this sort of inefficient ministry that we have to sort of, adopt and embrace in order to be incarnational, as you're saying, to get to know folks. But what might we begin to find as being some of the issues, just so we can think ahead as we're trying to minister to folks who are Asian American? But before we even jump into that, I have to ask the question, is the phrase or term Asian American helpful for us to even understand how to minister to folks that we call Asian American?
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, if you go to Asia, rarely will you hear people say, "I'm Asian." They'll usually say, "I'm Korean," which I am, or "I'm Chinese," or I'm Vietnamese, or I'm Filipino. So this whole notion of being Asian, or from the Orient, as as Europeans would have called it back through history, is a way that we have been categorized together and lumped together, even though our experiences might have been very different and divergent. And so one of the things that happens is as we're put into the same category is that our unique experiences are not accounted for. And so many populations came in the 70s and the 80s as refugees, especially from Southeast Asia. But not all Southeast Asians came as refugees, right? And so, Singapore, for example, Singaporeans would be considered Southeast Asians, but they wouldn't have a similar experience to those to the Vietnamese who came as refugees. And settled into the U.S. And so they get lumped together in a way that's unhelpful and essentially gets erased from being seen. And I think that's one of the challenges of using terms like Asian American or Latino or Hispanic, or even you think about African American. The reason that we have African American, and you would know this better than me, is because most African Americans who came by way of slave ship couldn't trace where they're from originally, because that was never accounted for, and so they're lumped together in ways that erase basically their own ethnic ancestry and heritage.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think we do this, yes, with Asian Americans. Because we say Asian American, well, as you mentioned, Taiwanese, Japanese, Chinese. I mean, there's, and then other, groups that have come, and then we do this with Hispanic Americans. Well, you have Dominicans, you have, Cubans, you have, Brazilians, you have Mexicans. I mean, so some of these titles or labels that we give people sort of reduce the richness of the cultures, into just one generic, efficient lump. And so now, as we have just made it even more complex,
that's right.
help our brothers and sisters who are watching who are non-Asian, if we can still use that term, because we just destroyed it kind of, but for lack of a better word, help our non-Asian brothers and sisters who want to love and support Asians, especially Asian Americans as they're in ministry. What should we keep in mind?
Yeah.
What should we think about? What would be helpful? Just help us think through this a little bit.
Yeah. I should say that there are helpful, I don't know if I said this earlier, but there are helpful, there are ways in which the category of being Asian is helpful, or Asian American is helpful. I don't know if I said that earlier. But it's helpful in the sense that, there's a camaraderie that exists among Asian Americans because our experiences in the United States are very similar. So even though our experiences from our kind of our home countries or our ethnic or our kind of native countries are different, when we came to the U.S., we were essentially treated in the same way, and so you'll hear a lot of Asian Americans have similar experiences. Typically, it's lumped more between East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and then South Asians and the Southeast Asians. But so that there are it is somewhat of a helpful thing that it helps us to see how we're connected. In terms of ministering to Asian Americans, if there are Asians within your churches or within your neighborhoods, and that was one of the things I was most surprised with, is that the people who reached out that were in leadership of churches to the article that you're referencing, most of them had significant pockets of Asians and Asian Americans within their congregations and within their neighborhoods, and so they felt. So what I wrote resonated with them to the point where they said we need to figure out ways to minister to them in ways that I think areas that don't have as many Asians, or the Asians are kind of in locations that aren't necessarily seen, they didn't feel as urgent of a need to reach out. And so I thought that was interesting personally. I I think that there's, like Asians aren't monolithic as African Americans aren't monolithic, or Latinos and Latinas aren't monolithic, and so you'll get different answers from people based on where they live, like according to like class. So if they're living in upper class suburbs versus lower class kind of rural or exurbs or areas that that don't have as much economic power. And so you'll have different experiences from different places, but I think some ways that are overarching that would be helpful for people to know is that a lot of Asian American oppression has been silenced, and even if as I say this, a lot of people probably think, well, Asian Americans weren't oppressed, they're like, they've never been oppressed. When have they ever been oppressed? And so that in and of itself reveals how the Asian American oppression or the racism that had existed that exists and has existed against Asian Americans has been silenced or eliminated or erased from kind of our memory. And a part of that is due to the black and white binary, is that when things don't fall neatly within the spectrum of black and white, things that fall up outside of that don't really register to Asian American or to others who are kind of hearing the experiences, the difficulties of Asian Americans, Latinos and Latinas, and then Native Americans as well. Some other ways that people can be mindful. This is not a comprehensive list, but Asian Americans feel the pressure often to eliminate our own ethnic and cultural distinctions in order to fit in and assimilate. And I think that's a shame, because the kingdom of God is a beautiful mosaic. You mentioned it earlier, that it's every tribe, nation, tongue, people gathered together to worship one Lord and one Savior and one baptism. And so I think to feel the pressure to eliminate that really comes from the Asian American ability to kind of read the surroundings and the atmosphere and say, okay, my Asianness is not necessarily welcome here. And a part of that is due to, if, for example, I'm a second generation Korean American, my parents are first generation, they're the ones that came from Korea to the United States. And a lot of times when I was growing up, the message was, don't be Asian or don't be Korean in these predominantly white spaces, because you're not going to be welcome. And that was a result of them not necessarily feeling welcome when they first arrived to the US. And they would say, the more you assimilate, the more you will succeed. And so like, I love Korean food. And hopefully, everyone will get to try Korean food someday. And it's more than just Korean barbecue. But they wouldn't let me take kimchi, for example, to school because they thought it would be offensive to all the other kids. And I felt like that was a way of eliminating, while they were trying to be mindful, because kimchi is an acquired taste and an acquired smell. That's right. But it's delicious. And when people get accustomed to it, they want more of it. And so that's one thing. I think a lot of times Asian Americans will also try to blend in out of respect and deference. Asians tend to have a deferential kind of approach to things, and so a lot of times we won't speak until we're spoken to. And I think that both helps us, that both honors those around us, but it also hurts us because people don't hear the contributions of Asian Americans as much as we have to contribute.
And just real quick, I think that's a very powerful this idea for us to get our minds around, because in contrast with African Americans, I think there's much more diversity in this conversation, in that there are some people who assimilate more, and there are people who just refuse to assimilate and just let all their differences just hang out and say, hey, I'm going to be unapologetically who I am. But what I think you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, overwhelmingly, or at least more so than in the African American community, it's just a cultural disposition to give that deference. And that deference then makes those wonderful distinctions culturally amongst Asian Americans just sort of melt away or blend in. And then I think you said that those cultural distinctions and nuances have to be drawn out by whatever culture is the majority. Is that appropriate to say? And so, and just because, and just hearing your experience, especially with the kimchi, just because there's silence there doesn't necessarily mean it's an affirmation of the status quo.
That's right. That's
There's
a great way to say it.
Yeah, there's probably a wrestling that's going on because of the silence, not the, hey, this is great, let's just let it keep going how it is. And so I'm just drawing that out of what you were already saying.
No, that's really great. I mean, and one of the things that, again, going back to the article, that I was surprised by is how it awakened in a lot of Asian Americans who are in these predominantly white churches, their own experience. And so I had several emails or messages that came through where people were telling me that they're crying. And they were like, it's the first time that someone articulated the experience that they felt like they were crazy for thinking. And so they don't have enough conversations with each other in these spaces because they don't want to quote unquote rock the boat. And because they don't want to rock the boat, they end up kind of self-censoring them, their experiences in a way that internalizes and then suppresses the difficulties and challenges that they have in spaces that don't really account for the cultural differences.
Yeah, so if I could, just jumping out of order in the questions that I gave you, so this is my fault.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that because of the deference, I think that's a good word to describe, the ethos of, Asian American cultures just in general. It seems that there's this idea of the Asians being the model minority. Explain to us what that is and all of that and how that sort of fits into that conversation.
Yeah, so I think there are two dominant stereotypes that really plague Asian Americans. The first is the model minority myth, and the second is the perpetual foreigner myth. The model minority, and there's usually some truth to stereotypes, but there are problems when people become reduced to the stereotype, right? That's all they are. That the stereotype becomes essential to their being, and I think that's where some challenges emerge. So the model minority myth is basically a myth that says we are the type of minority that America wants and that the United States prefers, and that is oftentimes used as a wedge against between the whites in America and then all the other people groups who don't quote unquote achieve. And so we are in some ways, and this word doesn't always land well with some people, but we're weaponized to essentially offend and put down blacks and Latinos and other people groups in America who didn't and can't achieve as we have. The problem with the model minority myth is that it both silences Asian Americans and it puts a tremendous amount of pressure upon us, and it wedges us between the dominant group and then all the other subdominant groups, where we really feel as Asian Americans homeless, and everyone else feels like that there's an enemy within Asian Americans as well, because we're used as.
So it almost seems like you're getting fired at from both sides.
Yep, that's right.
So from the dominant culture, you're saying, oh, they're the model. Well, why? Because they give deference to their culture. And then you have other minority groups, African Americans, Hispanics, who are looking at you from the other side and saying, if you would just be who you are, they would quit calling you the model minority and calling us to that standard of assimilation. And so, yet, the entire time, there's a group of Asian Americans who just feels ripped out of the frame because they're getting fired at from both sides. And even internally, there's this wrestling of, yes, we do want to, be here and be successful and not be relegated to any extreme, but we also, so there's this. I guess I'm sensing for the first time how difficult it might be to be in that space because of the external and internal sort of wrestlings that this would cause.
Yeah.
And so that's just another dynamic for us to keep in mind as we move forward in ministering to folks.
Yeah.
Sort of releasing them from that in whatever ways that we can.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also prevents us from speaking up, and so one of the things that you asked was how can we better minister to Asian Americans. One of the kind of consistent patterns I see within Asian Americans is how we don't seek leadership positions. We wait to be invited. And so I think it was Paul Tokunaga from InterVarsity who said that Asian Americans are reluctant leaders. And we're reluctant because one, we're constantly gauging our surroundings, and we're wondering, hey, is this a place where, like my voice will be welcomed? But also there's a type of like self-questioning that takes place in a lot of Asian Americans where we feel like we're never good enough to assume certain leadership roles. And so that usually puts us at a disadvantage because we don't kind of take the bull by its horns and then say, I want to lead this. We tend to wait to be invited, and then even then we want to be convinced that we're ready to be leaders, even though we are very capable of leading,
Yeah.
And so
just to reiterate this again, because I think what you said is a very important, reluctant leadership. And so by contrast, the person who is trying to appoint leaders, they need to not only go out and say, will you come lead, but then affirm the reasons why they're capable of leading too, because there's that self-questioning. And so I think those are two important nuggets to take away of going and pursuing, and then not only pursuing and putting into place, but after they're put in place, to encourage and to fan the flame of those skills and abilities that God's given. So I think that's profound.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about here.
Yeah.
Very very just briefly, I know there's a lot of distinction between first generation immigrants and then the second generation, those who are sort of naturalized citizens of America. What is a thing or two that you might say, okay, here's one of the biggest distinctions in ministering to these two generations?
Yeah, I mean, the immigrant reality is a huge reality that I don't think everyone understands, and usually because it's been villainized in media, like, oh, immigrants are the enemy or whatnot, that experience is often minimized in significant ways that create challenges and barriers to the flourishing of people who have literally left everything in order to kind of start a new life here, or for whatever shape, or for whatever reason. A lot of times, I find that the adjustment and the transition is challenging because, when you're coming from another country, you know that you're going to go into a different space, but you don't know how different that space is going to be. And when you enter that space, half the time you're trying to navigate in your own mind and map out what is normal, what's not normal, why things are done this way here, the language issues, and that's a full-time job. That's a half-time life, of trying to transition and kind of read the scenario and the setting. Second generation have very different experience. They feel oftentimes, because I'm second generation, and again, my experience is one slice of many second generation experiences, but I'm going to try to say the things that are probably most common. We have a hard time navigating between what it means to be Asian and American. Right? So there's no one definition of Asian American, and because it doesn't fit along the black and white binary, we still don't have a idea of what an archetype of Asian American is, for better and for worse. Yeah. And so people often feel guilty for being too American, and people feel ashamed for being too Asian a lot of times, because they don't know how to navigate the Asian American hyphenated reality. In some ways, I think it's and Daniel Lee out of Fuller, used this as an example, and I think it's helpful. It's the difference between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, where Booker T. Washington was just like, hey, we want a space. I want a space at the table. I would love it if the dominant culture would just give us some access and some ability to be educated and participate in society. Whereas and he was a slave, and he came out of slavery. Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois was essentially so he would be considered. So Booker T. Washington would be considered like a first generation immigrant, I guess. And then W.E.B. Du Bois would be a second or third generation immigrant because he was like, no, I'm American. Like give us equity. We don't want to just kind of be in the corner. We want to be a full participating people, and we don't want anything less than that. And so, where they were coming from shaped what they wanted and what they thought they can get from the dominant society. And I think that's very common within the Asian American experience as well. The longer we are here, the more we want equity, but because of the perpetual foreigner stereotype that's placed upon us, even if you're here for 5 generations, you're still an immigrant or you're still a foreigner, and that keeps us down in a lot of ways, even though some of us achieve and become CEOs or whatever.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, there's so much to think through there. My hope is that the people of God, we would all see ourselves as perpetual foreigners, because this is not our home. I would hope that the church in America, as it manifests itself locally, can be a place where perpetual foreigners can find some solace, some unity found in Christ. I pray that this little video that we did would allow ministers of the gospel to continue to find ways that they can make the places where the gospel is being preached and taught and lived out and restoration is being had to be a moment where folks from Asian backgrounds can find that home. Find that root, that place to root. So if you have one more idea as we just sort of zoom out to the larger conversation on race and ethnicity, what would you give us as we close?
Yeah, I've got a few ideas. The first, I think, is that what you just said is exactly right. We are exiles living in a foreign land as Christians, but our church communities should not feel that way. I think our church community should feel like home because we're with family. We're with the body of Christ. And it's sad that our experiences as racialized people of color, or in a racialized society as people of color, are oftentimes difficult because we expect and we anticipate that when we enter into a church, we're going to feel at home. But then the experience is no different, or there's very little difference between the world and the church in that experience, and that's challenging. And of course, there are exceptions, right? There are exceptions to these experiences, but I think the consistent pattern is that there's a lot more similarity between the church and the world when it comes to racialization than there are kind of differences. I think a few things that would be helpful takeaways as we kind of zoom out and come to a close is, I think it would be helpful for everyone to examine our own presuppositions, to say, what do we see as normal and why do we see it as normal? Bo Hughes gave a great sermon he's at the Village Church in Texas, and he essentially used this illustration about right-handed scissors and or right-handedness versus left-handedness. We live in a right-handed normative world, and because of that, left-handed people are constantly having to adjust and find ways to fit in, but this world kind of isn't designed for them, and so they even have to make left-handed scissors. But we don't call the right-handed scissors right-handed scissors; we just call them scissors. I thought that was a great illustration that he used to show that there's normativity that can sometimes make people feel like they have to go through a couple extra steps in order to kind of fit in or to gain access to the community and to all the resources within the community. And so I think it's helpful to examine our own presuppositions. I do think that we need to continue to press into the reality that our churches were overlaid on top of a racialized reality, and that we have to dismantle that together. And a part of that is going to be painful because we're challenging the things that we have grown accustomed to and see as normal in terms of our cultural expressions. I think one of the greatest challenges that I see in America or in the United States is how we have participated in a segregated discipleship. And so I'm trying to write something on this, but I don't have when I get to sit down and try to type it up, I never can finish it. But because we are living, because our our Christianity has been overlaid on top of a racialized and segregated reality. Our discipleship has been segregated. And because of that, I, as an Asian American, unless I take the time to walk over to you as an African American, will not understand your experience as a gospel-loving, Christ-exalting believer in this country. And one of the things that we have to do is dismantle the segregated discipleship. And so I love what John Perkins calls people to do. And one of the 3 R's, reconciliation, there's another R, and then there's relocation. I think we need to be mindful about where we live as much as we are mindful about where we worship and the theology that we pursue. So I think one of the great challenges is what I call segregated discipleship. I think we need also a more robust theology and its appropriate praxis around diversity and difference. I don't think we have a solid theology of diversity. And because we don't have a solid theology of diversity, we are combating the world's definition of diversity, and we're bumping up against all the issues that we actually need to address, but we're afraid to talk about it because the world's definition of diversity is not necessarily a biblical definition of diversity. And I think we need a better theology of diversity that can help us lead more robustly into the future. And I also think we need to learn how to navigate difference. I think more than any other group, because we are so segregated as Christians, I think more than any other group, in America, we might be segregated. I think most people, over 80% of all Christians attend homogenous churches. The Martin Luther King quote that's appropriately and overused, that the 11 o'clock hour on a Sunday is the most segregated hour, continues to ring true to this day. I think those things have significant impact on how we move forward. And then I think some other things are that we could enter into spaces led by people who are different from us. Michael Emerson out of North Park, he's a provost at North Park, wrote Divided by Faith. He noted that in his 25-year longitudinal study, he has found that there has been a consistent or an increased trend of people of color that are entering into predominantly white spaces and churches, but there's no significant number of people that are moving from that of our white brothers and sisters that are going into churches that are predominantly Black or Asian or Hispanic or Latino. And that means that the burdens are again placed on us to make a church multi-ethnic instead of the other way around. And that leads to some challenges. I think we have to increase meaningful social contact. The other thing I think is helpful is to establish a plurality of diverse leadership. That's the biggest challenge. I mean, you'll look at churches that say we're about multi-ethnic, multicultural, and yet when you look at their staff and elder boards, they're oftentimes not multi-ethnic and not multicultural, or if they are, there's usually a tokenized position that has to bear the burden of speaking on behalf of all the people of color in their institutions or organizations or churches. And that's a tremendous amount of weight to put on one person. And if you're just looking at group dynamics, if you're the only person of color, like if you're the only woman in a room, it becomes difficult to speak up because everyone else has one framework of thinking, typically, and you might have a slightly different framework of thinking. And to speak against the majority in the room of leaders is really difficult and nerve-wracking. And so, that leads to racial battle fatigue and exhaustion and other things that create problems. I think one of the great disservices that we're doing currently is we are weary of sociological language. I don't think that because, and Ligon Duncan at the T4G this year said something beautiful. He said, we failed to do this, we failed to live out the second commandment. And he said, we failed to love our brothers and sisters because we started calling all these issues that were trying to identify the marginalized experiences of different people. We call them social issues, or we started calling them liberal or progressive, or the social gospel, or cultural Marxism, or whatever you call it. And I think that as theology teaches us how to love God and love neighbor, because of our segregated realities and our minimization of the marginalized experiences of people of color and Christians of color, sociology has taken the place of what theology should have done, and it has identified the ways and the problem areas in which we need to love one another. And so it points out, hey, this is an issue, this is an issue, this is an issue, and this is an issue. So it gives us language to how to address some of the problems, and of course, looking at history. So I think we need a three-pronged approach of theology, of history, and of sociology in order to move forward. I think sociology, Henry Kim at Wheaton, one of my colleagues says, and he says, sociology without theology is blind, sociology without theology is hopeless, but theology without sociology is blind. And I think that's helpful in addressing some of the challenges that we're seeing. And so I think we need to stop being as suspicious of sociology, but we need to make sure that the appropriate theology is following suit. And then I think that's really it. So
Sounds good. Well,
those are a few things
thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.
Again, this is from the lectern. This is Walter Strickland with Ray Chang of Wheaton College. Grateful that you guys have joined us. And if you want some more information about Kingdom Diversity at Southeastern, you can go to kingdomdiversity.sebts.edu. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow us at K_diversity. Or if you just want information about Southeastern, you can go to sebts.edu. Grace and peace.